This is Circleville, a small Ohio town. Pumpkin festivals, Sunday potlucks, a place where, at least in the late 1970s, people expected the mail to be ordinary. Instead, it began arriving with accusations, threats, and a kind of steady, corrosive voice that refused to be answered. Now, when are you going to believe you aren't going to get out of there? I told you 2 years ago, when we set 'em up, they stay set up. That line was sent to a man behind bars. His name was Paul Freshour. He said he had nothing to do with the letters. The letters kept coming.
Wow.
Yeah. It reads like a line from a thriller, and yet this is real. Circleville, Ohio, Pickaway County. Population in the 1970s, around 10 to 13,000. Everyone knows someone. Everyone knows, or thinks they know, how everyone else lives.
Small towns are like pressure cookers for this kind of thing.
Exactly. But let's start at the beginning. The poison pen letters, what people now call the Circleville letters, first appear publicly in 1976 or 1977. They begin by singling out a school bus driver named Mary Gillispie, sometimes spelled Gillispie, sometimes Gillespie in accounts, and they accuse her of having an affair with the school superintendent, Gordon Gord Massey. The letters were not subtle. They were moralistic, vindictive. They often used block printing, odd punctuation, poor grammar, and a style that seemed intended to humiliate.
You mentioned they were moralizing. That pattern, accusing, naming, trying to humiliate, fits a particular profile I see in anonymous harassers. The combination of arrogance and a sense of moral rectitude. They want to control public perception.
Right. The letters didn't stay private. They spread. Ron, Mary's husband, began getting them. School officials and board members fought them. Roadside signs appeared accusing Mary of sexual misconduct, even attaching signs to her bus route that local children could see. The writer seemed to know private schedules, routes, routines, where people worked. It suggested someone local. People began watching their mail. They changed their routes. They looked at each other differently. The writer seemed to know private schedules, routes, routines, where people worked. It suggested someone local. People began watching their mail. They changed their routes. They looked at each other differently.
Terrifying.
Terrifying, yes. And then the pressure on Ron, the husband, escalates. He starts getting letters implying his wife is cheating. One night in August of 1977, August 19, Ron receives a phone call believed to be from the letter writer. He's angry, grabs his .22, and leaves in his truck to confront whoever's behind it. A short time later, his pickup is found crashed into a tree on a rural road, and Ron is dead. Officially, authorities ruled it an accident. He had a high blood alcohol level. But friends and family said he wasn't a heavy drinker. He didn't seem intoxicated that night. And why had his gun been fired once? There was no other vehicle involved. Suspicious to many, unexplained to all.
So the town's terror moves from words to a real death. That always changes the stakes. People stop seeing anonymity as harmless mischief.
Exactly. And the letters continue. Then, years later, they escalate again. This time, not just words, but a near-kill device. February 7th, 1983, Mary, driving her bus, sees an offensive sign. She stops the bus to remove it. There's a string or wire attaching the sign to a box, and inside that box sits a crudely rigged .25 caliber pistol, designed to fire when the sign was tampered with. It didn't discharge. Either it malfunctioned or it was not fully set, but it was unmistakably a booby trap. The serial number had been partially filed off, then restored by the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. The tracing led back to a man named Paul Freshour.
Pause. Paul. Who was he?
Paul was Ron's brother-in-law. He'd worked as a supervisor at an Anheuser-Busch facility. Some accounts describe him as educated, college degree, maybe even a master's. He was a former prison guard, even worked as an extra as a guard in the film Brubaker. In 1983, Paul was in a bitter divorce with his wife, Karen Sue. Investigators connected the gun in the booby trap via a sales record to a coworker back to Paul. He cooperated with police, said the gun had been stolen from his garage, allowed searches, gave handwriting samples without counsel, and reportedly failed a polygraph. The sheriff, Dwight Radcliffe, believed strongly that Paul was responsible.
So police have the gun link, a motive framed by family conflict, and some handwriting similarities. That's enough to build a case, especially in a small town where narratives spread quickly.
But, and this is important, Paul was tried and convicted only for the attempted murder related to the booby trap. He was never formally charged with writing the anonymous letters. Yet the letters followed him into the courtroom. Mary testified about the letter campaign, and handwriting experts testified that Paul's writing could match the letters. The jury found him guilty in October 1983 and sentenced him to 7 to 25 years.
And that might have been the end of it. Except the letters kept coming.
Right. That's the part that keeps forensic people, journalists, and the public awake. Letters continued to arrive after Paul's arrest, after his conviction, and crucially, while he was in prison, even when the warden placed him under tight controls, solitary confinement, denial of pens and paper. The prison monitored incoming and outgoing mail carefully. The warden at the Lima facility eventually wrote, in effect, that it was impossible for Paul to be sending the letters from inside prison. That contradiction sits at the heart of the case's lingering unease.
That single fact, continued letters while the suspect is under lock and scrupulous surveillance, creates a major explanatory gap. Either the prison oversight failed in a dramatic way, or the real writer was someone else.
Exactly. There's a notable example. Paul receives a letter in prison boasting, "Now, when are you going to believe you aren't going to get out of there? I told you 2 years ago when we set 'em up, they stay set up." The letter uses "we," which to many reads like a confession of having set a trap to frame him. For Paul's defenders, that letter, sent to him while he was heavily controlled, was nearly proof he'd been framed. For those who think Paul is guilty, it could be external actors carrying on the campaign at his direction, or someone outside imitating the style.
Let's talk about the forensic dispute, because this case is a classic clash between behavioral profiling and document examination. Which experts were involved?
Decades later, CBS's 48 Hours brought in former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole to review the letters and the behavioral pattern. She reviewed dozens, 98 in some accounts, and concluded the writer showed a consistent profile: callous, power-seeking, enjoyed humiliation and public shaming, likely acted the same way in daily life, and probably wasn't highly educated. That profile, O'Toole argued, did not square neatly with Paul's known background. In contrast, forensic document examiner Beverly East conducted a handwriting analysis on 49 anonymous letters and compared them to known Paul samples. East concluded, very strongly, that Paul wrote the letters. She pointed to distinctive letter formations, especially Paul's peculiar capital G that looks more like a 6, and certain number forms and zip codes. She famously said she was 100% sure one person wrote the letters she examined, and that person was Paul.
So O'Toole says behaviorally this doesn't fit. East says, on paper, the handwriting matches. That's agonizing for both the family and anyone trying to reach a verdict on the letters.
It is agonizing, and beyond the experts, there are other voices. Martin Yount, a local journalist and private investigator, raised doubts about the investigation, suggesting that once the gun led to Paul, investigators developed tunnel vision. Robin Yoakum, a reporter who later wrote about the case, chronicled the complexities. Sheriff Radcliffe maintained his view that Paul was responsible. Even so, the prison warden and some later analysts expressed doubt. The tension between documentary analysis and behavioral inference is real and unresolved in public perception.
Let me pick at one thread: the letter's continuity while Paul was incarcerated. You said many letters were postmarked from Columbus rather than Lima. That detail matters.
Yes. Sources indicate many continued letters were postmarked from Columbus, not Lima, and the prison warden's investigations, 2 or 3 internal inquiries, concluded that Paul could not have been writing them from inside the facility. He had restricted access to writing materials. He was in solitary. He was monitored. Yet letters kept appearing, some addressed to Paul himself. To me, that suggests strongly that at least part of the campaign was being run by someone outside the prison. Whether that someone was collaborating with Paul before his incarceration or had other motives is unknown.
Could Paul have orchestrated letters prior to incarceration that were then mailed over years? Stored drafts, third parties remailing? Logistically difficult across a decade, but possible.
Potentially. Critics of Paul's innocence say he could have prepared letters in advance and set up others to mail them, or he could have communicated through coded channels. But the warden's certainty and the timing complicate that explanation. The letters spanned into the 1990s and apparently tapered off around 1994, about the year Paul was paroled. That timing, letters stopping around his release, can be read both ways. If Paul was the writer, maybe his supply or motivation dwindled. If he was innocent, perhaps the real writer stopped once media attention faded, or once the person thought of the case as done. There's a symmetry that never resolves.
Let's back up and talk about motive and possible alternative suspects. Karen Sue, his estranged wife, is often mentioned. What do we know?
Karen Sue lived in a trailer on Mary's property at one point. She and Paul were mid-divorce in 1983. Investigators say she gave detailed accounts to police. She claimed to have found torn-up letters at the Fresher home, and she told them that Paul was the Circleville writer. She also allegedly stood to gain financially if Paul went to prison. Some accounts suggest she would benefit in the divorce. Journalists and some podcasters have argued she had motive and proximity to Mary's life, which could explain the detailed knowledge in the letters. On the other hand, others say Karen Sue became a convenient villain, a face to attach blame to, without direct evidence beyond motive and suspicious behavior. Police never named her as a formal suspect.
So she's an easy narrative, but not a proven one. There are also theories about a townsman or multiple writers.
Yes. Given the letters touched on more than just the Gillispies, accusations of embezzlement, corruption, different scandals, some theorize the writer was a local with broad knowledge, possibly someone in the school system or a disgruntled resident. Others suggest there might have been multiple writers or copycats across decades. Beverly East insisted one person wrote the letters she examined. Other analysts point to inconsistencies in tone and content over nearly 2 decades, which could mean more than one hand. And then there are conspiracy scenarios, more elaborate but lacking direct evidence, suggesting a clique of locals used the letters and the trap to settle scores.
These alternative theories expose another truth about anonymous harassment. It creates space for projection. People fill the void with their worst suspicions.
Absolutely. And Circleville is a textbook example of how a community fractures. Small town dynamics heighten the damage. Reputation matters. Allegations, even anonymous ones, can ruin careers, marriages, and trust. The writer weaponized that vulnerability.
I want to dwell on trial mechanics for a moment. At trial, evidence about the letters was introduced despite Paul not being charged for letter writing. That seems like a crucial strategic choice.
It was crucial. Prosecutors introduced the letter campaign to shape jurors' minds about motive and the nature of the harm. Handwriting experts testified that Paul's writing could match. But keep in mind, document examination is probabilistic. Experts may say similarities are consistent, not that it's an absolute match. The defense pointed to the lack of direct physical evidence. No fingerprints on the trap box that tied Paul to constructing or placing it, no eyewitnesses, and an alibi for much of the relevant period. They also questioned Karen Sue's motives and whether someone could have used Paul's gun without his knowledge, especially if it had indeed been stolen.
And then there was the polygraph he supposedly failed.
Right. Polygraphs are unreliable and often inadmissible, but investigators sometimes treat them as confirmation. In Paul's case, it's mentioned he failed one about the booby trap and the letters. That deepened suspicion, but it's not decisive in a court of law.
What about Ron's death? There are lingering questions about the fired gun, and blood alcohol remains officially an accident, correct?
Correct. Officials ruled it an accident, drunk driving. His blood alcohol was reported at a level indicating heavy intoxication. Many family members dispute he was a heavy drinker. His gun had been fired once, but there's no clear link to a homicide. No other vehicle was involved. Some have suggested he might have been forced off the road or staged, but there's no official evidence to support that. The death remains a suspicious but unresolved element of the broader story.
That death, whether accident or something else, became a catalyst for greater turmoil and perhaps a motive for vengeance. Or it became the raw material for an intense grief that sought someone to blame.
Yes, and the broader pattern speaks to the psychological cost of long-term anonymous harassment. Mary, as a bus driver, became publicly shamed. The signs were placed along her route. Children could see them. That's an escalation from private letter to public humiliation, which often marks a transition in the harasser's intent.
You used the phrase power and control trip earlier. Can we unpack that? Why do anonymous writers do this?
From O'Toole's perspective, the writer was driven by dominance, deriving pleasure from humiliation. The letters didn't just report alleged facts, they punished. They sought social death to isolate and shame. In small towns, social death is nearly as devastating as physical harm. The anonymity lets the writer act with perceived impunity, turning gossip into a tool that rearranges social standing. As the campaign escalated, someone moved from words to a device that could physically harm, or at least terrify another person, which marks a dangerous crossing of boundaries.
Let's touch on media involvement. This case got national attention. Unsolved Mysteries, CBS's 48 Hours. How did that affect things?
It amplified and complicated the story. Unsolved Mysteries filmed a segment in the early 1990s. Before filming, producers received an ominous postcard. Forget Circleville, Ohio. If you come to Ohio, you sickos will pay. The Circleville writer. The show went ahead. By then, Paul had either been released or was about to be paroled in the early 1990s. On camera, he insisted on his innocence and asked for a real re-examination. The case migrated from a local scandal to a national curiosity, a classic unsolved mystery, inviting more scrutiny, more theories, and more public debate. Media exposure also tends to freeze narratives. People latch on to either the fresher did it story or the fresher was framed story, and those narratives harden.
And the experts' disagreements, O'Toole versus East, are emblematic of the limits of certainty in forensic work. O'Toole says behaviorally it doesn't fit Paul. East says the handwriting matches 100%. How do listeners reconcile that?
They rarely reconcile it. Both are authoritative voices, but they answer different questions. East asks, do the letters on paper match Paul's known handwriting features? She answers yes, emphatically, citing the distinctive G and number forms. O'Toole asks, given the content and the pattern of cruelty, education level, and logistics, does Paul fit the behavioral template? She expresses doubt. Both can be right in their terms, or both can be wrong. Handwriting can be imitated. Behavior can be misread. The result is unresolved evidentiary tension.
Let's look at the timeline later in the case. Paul gets parole around 1994. Letters stop. He dies in 2012. The sheriff declared the matter closed, attributing responsibility to Paul, but no court ever tied him legally to the letters. So the official record is partial attempted murder conviction, but not letter authorship.
Correct. Sheriff Radcliffe considered the case closed and essentially attributed responsibility to Freshour. Yet Paul was only convicted of the attempt on Mary's life. He was never charged for the letters. Independent investigators remain divided. Many questions linger. Who wrote the letters during Paul's strict incarceration? If Paul did write them, how did he do it? If not him, who had both the motive and the means? And why did letters stop around his release? Each of those questions invites multiple, sometimes contradictory answers.
From a psychological angle, the "we" in the taunting prison letter is particularly interesting. It suggests either a collaborator, someone boasting about participation, or an attempt to sow confusion. A single writer will sometimes adopt plural pronouns to amplify fear, make it feel like a conspiracy.
Yes, and some interpret that "we" as evidence of a frame. We set him up. People read it as a confession from someone who participated in framing Paul. Others read it merely as the writer's rhetorical flourish, intended to project strength or networked power. Again, ambiguous and interpretive.
What about the forensic restoration of the serial number on the gun? That was pivotal, right?
Pivotal. The Bureau of Criminal Investigation restored the partially filed serial number from the .25 pistol used as the booby trap and traced it to a coworker who had sold the gun to Paul. That link moved the investigation from anonymous letters into a tangible device that could be connected, however circumstantially, to Paul. That move is what gave investigators something to hold on to. But circumstantial linkage is not the same as a direct nexus proving who placed the device in the field.
And we have the broader social cost, family split, reputations ruined, a community left to argue for decades. That's the enduring cruelty of anonymity.
Yes. Mary's life was particularly affected. Roadside signs, allegations about her family and daughter, rumors about the superintendent. The community fractured. People watched neighbors and trusted less. The case is a cautionary tale about how anonymous attacks can unravel a small-town social fabric.
Aaron, if you had to pull out 3 unresolved, crucial questions that, if answered, would change everything, what would you pick?
Good question. Number 1. Who actually wrote the letters that persisted while Paul was in strict custody? If we could definitively prove they came from someone else, that would undermine the official closure. Number 2. Was the booby trap truly the letter writer's escalation, or was it a separate act, perhaps intended to frame someone? Answering whether the trap setter and the letter writer were the same person would shift the narrative. Number 3. What happened the night Ron Gillispie died? Was it purely an accident, or was foul play involved? Clarifying that could reshape motive analysis from the earliest years.
Solid picks. Each of those would pivot the narrative. Do we have any recently emerged physical evidence that could be retested with modern methods? DNA, for example.
The source material we're using, CBS, Unsolved Mysteries, and the journalistic accounts, doesn't present any confirmed new DNA breakthroughs. The case's modern re-examinations focused mainly on handwriting and profiling, not on biological evidence. If there is preserved physical evidence, a modern reanalysis might help, but the public record doesn't describe such tests. The central evidentiary battles remain documentary and circumstantial.
That's limiting. Without biological evidence, the case relies on contested forensic opinions and circumstantial timelines.
Yes, and that will always leave room for doubt. People on both sides of the argument can marshal credible authorities to support their views. Beverly East's 100% sure feels decisive to some, while Mary Ellen O'Toole's profile feels decisive to others. Neither bridges the logistical problem of letters under prison control.
And there's the human element. Paul claimed his innocence until his death in 2012. He said something memorable. "When I'm dead and in my grave, people are going to believe I'm sending those letters." That line was reported by Robin Yoakum in a 1989 interview. It's a grim prediction, one that rings true regardless of the objective answer.
Yes, that quote captures the lingering injustice that a person can be convicted for one act and forever haunted by associated accusations that never resulted in charges. And for many victims of anonymous harassment, there's no single justice. Mary and others who were targeted never got a full legal conclusion about the letter's authorship.
If listeners want to investigate further, where should they look in the public record?
Start with CBS News pieces. They did multiple features, including 48-hour segments that brought in both O'Toole and East. Unsolved Mysteries has a long piece called Poison Pen Murder with archival material. Journalistic profiles by Martin Yount and Robin Yoakum's reporting are helpful. There are also community discussions online, like Reddit threads that collect timelines, useful but not primary. But, a warning, sift carefully. This case has many layers of speculation, and not all sources are equal.
What's your sense, Aaron, if you had to say what feels most likely, based only on the public record and without inventing facts, what would you lean toward?
I'll be careful here. Based strictly on the sources, I think the evidence that Paul was linked to the booby trap is strong. The gun trace is tangible, and it was his weapon. That supports the conviction for attempted murder. But whether he was the prolific letter writer is far less certain. The continued letters from addresses not consistent with his prison location, the warden's statements, and the credible voice of behavior analysts like O'Toole make me doubt that a single person, Paul alone, authored every letter over 2 decades. So I lean toward the explanation that Paul was involved in the booby trap and perhaps in the surrounding family conflict, but that the letter campaign likely had either multiple participants over time or an author who was not Paul. That's a cautious lean, not a definitive conclusion.
That cautiousness is exactly what this case requires. There's too much contradictory data for certainty.
Right. And the sadness of it is that no one gets a neat resolution. The sheriff can declare it closed, newspapers can move on, but families live with the ambiguity. Mary lived with the public shaming. Ron is dead with questions unanswered. Paul died insisting on his innocence. The letters stopped, a vindication to some, a silence to others. And the town of Circleville keeps its pumpkin festival and its memories, both small-town normal and quietly damaged by what happened.
Any final takeaways for people fascinated by unsolved or ambiguous cases?
A few. First, anonymous harassment can be weaponized in ways that are slow, patient, and devastating, and communities should treat it as a serious form of harm. Second, forensics, handwriting, profiling are tools, not verdicts. They must be weighed together with physical evidence and context. Third, tunnel vision in investigations is a real hazard. Once police seize on a suspect, alternative hypotheses can be neglected. And finally, this is more human than forensic. If you live in a tight community and someone starts pulling at the threads of private life, the consequences reverberate far beyond the person named in a letter. People get hurt, trust frays. And sometimes, in the absence of closure, we are left with the unease of not knowing, which might be the worst part.
Yeah, it's an eerie, tense story, sad and unresolved. Thanks, Erin.
Thank you, Marcus. Before we go, a final thought I want to leave listeners with. If you were on that jury, sitting in that small courtroom in October 1983, and the prosecution put the letters on the stand as evidence of motive, what reasonable doubt would you have raised? Think about the prison letters. Think about the warden's notes. You might find yourself shifting your perspective. If anything about Circleville lingers, it's that anonymous cruelty can outlast convictions, and true closure sometimes never arrives. Thanks for listening.
Interesting.